Hello and welcome to this year's edition of our Academies Benchmarking Report. We're now 12 years into this report and it's evolved quite a lot over the time. I'm sure you will all agree that it's a very useful report regardless of whether you're a head teacher, governor or head of finance. I think there's something in it for everyone. Pleased to be joined today by Becky Foy, one of our audit senior managers who specialises in education, and we'll pick up some of the slides as we go along. Next slide, please. So as an introduction, today we're not going to try and regurgitate the whole report. We're just going to pick up on some of the key findings. This year, it's based on over 300 trusts, which is 2,400 schools across the Kreston network. Might be obvious to some, but it's based on the latest set of statutory accounts. That's the 31st of August 2023. Some of the data is analysed out between primary, secondary and maths. And I think it gives useful comparisons and sometimes tells different stories depending on where you sit in the sector. I mean, it gives some useful comparisons both across regions and nationwide. And it gives you a good starting point. I don't think benchmarking will ever give you all the answers, but it gives you something to perhaps thought-provoke from there, to further analyse, to discuss and debate. Next slide, please. So I suppose in terms of admin, how to interpret the data, hopefully you've all seen the report, and at the end of this webinar there is a link to it if you haven't got a copy. But the definitions are on page 62, and perhaps those new to the sector might want to focus on the definitions to start with, the acronyms and so on that are quite school specific. We then on the next few pages list the data, and that's split into various different forms, and that's listed out below: primary, secondary and then maths, defined as small, medium and large depending on size, based on pupil numbers. Next slide, please. So I suppose this is the spoiler alert. Here we listed out the main highlights. I'll probably just keep it quite brief for now because we'll go into more detail as we go through. But huge operational challenges within the sector. I'm sure you'll sit there and say, well, there's always operational challenges, and I think that's absolutely true. But this year is no different to others in that regard. General increases in income, and we'll come on to that later. More maths are tending to pool resources, whether that be at GAG level or reserves level or both. We've seen quite a marked jump this year in that regard, and again we'll come into that in more detail. Won't surprise many that math sizes continue to rise and have year on year as trusts take on more schools. Also been quite a significant increase in centralisation. I think going back a couple of years, some schools were trying to stay quite decentralised. I think it's pretty widely accepted now that to gain real economies of scale and real benefits, you do need some form of central services and centralisation. Won't surprise anyone on the call that energy costs have been ridiculously high this year. We all know that in our home lives, but in a big school building, it's even more prevalent. There has been some reduction, but there's still quite a lot of uncertainty in the future in terms of energy costs. What surprised me actually was to see only modest increases in staff costs. I think across the board, there's actually been quite a lot of control on staff costs, and that's borne out within the report. Next page, please. So before we go into the detail, I suppose, what are the challenges and future trends that we've picked up on? Well, there's clearly a lot of uncertainty out there. Economic, I think we are now in a recession, and if not, we will be very soon, I suspect. Political, we may or may not end up with a new government, a Labour government, which will clearly have some impact on the public sector and specifically the education sector. And I suppose what's not listed there is social as well. There's quite a lot of social uncertainty, and the social needs and requirements of a school are changing, and that will change future funding and future expenditure. As I've already mentioned, uncertainty within energy costs. Will it increase? Will it remain at a slightly lower level? Given war in the Middle East and war in Eastern Europe, it's very hard to predict, but it doesn't particularly sound like a good environment for low energy costs. Pupil role dilemma. some of the statistics coming out are showing that the pupil intake at primary level is going to be lower over the next few years, and that will then filter and trickle into secondary schools as within 4 or 5 years' time, which will clearly have an impact on secondary schools, particularly the ones with large estates. So we'll need to start planning sooner rather than later for that. The focus on staff welfare, I think it's very clear that teachers and non-teaching staff are working very hard, perhaps close to capacity, and we are seeing some burnout and some absenteeism and so on from school, and something that I'm sure all educational trusts are looking at. On a slightly different note, the difficulty to attract volunteers and trustees, and we have some slides on this later, but we're seeing it is harder to attract particularly the younger generations, and perhaps I'll go into more detail on that later. Pension contributions, we don't really know what the long-term view on pension contributions, but if I was a betting man, I would say it's up, not down, and that clearly has a significant impact on school budgets. Potential changes to the independent school sector, and this is an interesting one. I'm sure many of you have read that within the Labour manifesto they have pledged to introduce VAT on independent school fees. What will that mean for the state education sector? Will there be a mass exodus from independent schools flooding into the state sector, and is there capacity for it? These are all questions I'm not necessarily sure I have the answer to, but certainly uncertainty. There is uncertainty that comes off the back of that. Next page, please. So moving now into the detail, and I'll pass over to Becky now to cover off some of the areas focused on in the benchmarking report, starting with the financial position and the balance sheets.
Yeah. So I think the overall message that we're seeing is that surpluses on an annual basis are becoming a lot smaller. Trusts are still finding it very difficult to budget for future years, and there is a lot less optimism in future financial positions and sustainability within trusts. And touching straight on to kind of the budgeting process and the overarching message that's being seen in the future budgets, and particularly the BFRs, is that the flaws in preparing the reports from the onset. And although the first year budgets tend to be quite reliable, that any years beyond that tends to be a lot less accurate due to the fact that the additional funding announcements and the cost increases are received too late, and a lot of the time the budgets have already been submitted before considering those. And then the uncertainty in the future funding has also ultimately resulted in a lot of trusts being very cautious when preparing their budgets. A lot of the time they underestimate the future revenues, but also very overly prudent in the future costs. This has also resulted in a lot of trusts postponing potential future investments into projects because they're just unclear about what's going to happen to their reserves going forward. And then specifically looking at the movements in reserves in the year, when we look at financial performance in trusts, we deem one of the best metrics to use is free reserves. And we've defined that as the unrestricted reserves, the designated funds, and GAG, but we exclude the capital and pension balances when reviewing this. And then when looking at the financial performance in the current year, although we're seeing the majority of the trusts making a small surplus, the overall performance has deteriorated when comparing to the prior years, with the primary sets being worst off. We've of course seen trusts take a lot of action when trying to control costs in the year, but have noted that this has been quite a hard process where there have been large pay rises and increases in energy costs. There have been late funding announcements in the year. For example, the mainstream school grant came in and the school supplementary grants. This on average gave primary schools about 60,000 extra, and secondary schools around 200,000 extra. So when comparing this to the overall position in the year, this was quite detrimental in pushing trusts from potentially a deficit position into a surplus position. And in November of last year, the ESFA did produce some guidance on trust reserves. And although there wasn't any new information in the publication, it did clarify a number of points, mainly highlighting what level of reserves that the trust should be considering to hold. And although trusts have the flexibility to determine suitable levels of reserves, the ESFA has highlighted that they will start to take reviews of certain trusts, this being trusts that they believe to be vulnerable, and they've suggested a lower percentage of about 5% of total income. And in addition, they have also said that they will look at monitoring trusts that have excessive income, excessive reserves, which they deem to be as 20% of total income in any 1 year. However, when the ESFA consider free reserves, they don't consider designated funds to be within this overall reserves balance. And therefore, trusts are looking to potentially ring fence some reserves to designated for future projects. And this potentially could stop some of the scrutiny from the ESFA. So then looking at the future financial position, and of course, everything is still very much uncertain. And as Darren already mentioned, the current demographic prediction suggests that there will be a lot fewer children within the school system, and that not kind of increasing until about 2032. And then on the other hand, again, the independent school market, with the threat of imposing the VAT on the school fees, it's uncertain how this is going to play out in the independent school market, and if children will seek to move into the state schools. So then next slide, please.
Great. So thanks for that, Becky. I think it'd be nice time to now add a poll question and get a bit of a contribution from everyone on the webinar. So I suppose a reasonably straightforward question. Based on your 3-year budget, are your total revenue reserves at the end of year 3 predicted to be lower, higher, or stay the same as they currently are? So I'll leave everyone a couple of perhaps 30 seconds to answer this, and then we'll start loading up the results and see how it comes out. Interesting question. I think yeah, what we're probably seeing is many are suggesting it will be lower, but you know, given all the uncertainty we've talked about here today, it is quite hard to predict. So perhaps we'll give another 10 seconds. Great, let's close the poll if that's okay. So in terms of where we are, lower tends to be the answer that's coming up, and you know, quite resounding in that case, and that's probably in line with what the report states, and also what my personal feeling would be. So yeah, interesting to see, and good to see everyone's on the same page, or most people on the same page. Thank you, Georgia. So moving on, and I think we're still with Becky. Becky is going to cover income. Over to you, Becky.
Thank you. So yeah, okay, so looking at the income, and I guess looking at the government and the autumn statement, it was quite quiet on the academy front. This is perhaps due to prior year announcements, which included multi-year funding. Having said that, though, in November 22, there was the announcement of the MSAG funding, which I already noted, which came into effect in April 23. And then again, there was a second announcement in July 23, confirming the additional support to help trusts with the teachers' pay increases. This totaled 900 million across the sector. But like noted earlier, these are all last minute announcements and probably hadn't been considered in the budgeting process to begin with. We've had a look at gag income per pupil compared with prior years, but highlighted in the report that this may not be directly comparable, with some changes of what has been included in gag income. For example, teachers' pay and pension funding had then been integrated into gag income from September 21. However, the sixth form funding in the current year was no longer included in GAG income. Either way, looking at the results in the report, the primary SATs have shown small increases, but all other trusts have experienced some sort of decrease or remain fairly static. But this does appear to be quite consistent with the funding levels that have been announced by the government. Looking at capital funding and the uncertainty around that, I think the only main guaranteed capital income for a lot of trusts is the default formula capital. But this is kind of quite a small amount in the grand schemes of it, and this kind of restricts the projects that a lot of trusts can undertake, or if they want to fund certain projects, they will probably have to use some of their own reserves. Larger MATs tend to be in a better situation where they're able to receive SCA funding on an annual basis. These are very much known amounts, and they can better plan on what capital projects they're going to undertake in any one year. However, a lot of trusts don't fall into this category and heavily rely on successful SIF bids to be able to undertake a lot larger projects. But with that said, they're noting we have seen a lot of drawbacks in this funding. One being that you need to bid for these, bid for the SIF funding. The funding is for very specific projects and can't be used on anything else. There's also priority for those schools that contribute some of their own reserves, and in some instances a lot of schools can't guarantee their own reserves when applying for these SIF bids, and we are seeing a lot more now that these SIF bids do come with a loan element. With that said, in the year there was additional funding of around 447 million to help with energy upgrades, given the significant energy cost increases. But trusts are still seeking additional funding for these larger projects to help with their estate management plans. Next slide, please, Georgia. Perfect. And then moving on to costs, and again, like Darren said earlier, staff costs as a percentage of total costs have remained under control this year, which is quite positive, but still an area of concern going forward for all trusts. This mainly due to the fact of we had the 6.5% teachers pay rise in July 23, and there's already recommendations going out for the pay increases for the 24-25 year. In addition, there was the agreed 5% teachers pension increase to the 28.6% coming into effect from April 24, with the government only confirming the funding for the first year. Our data shows that the staff cost as a proportion to total costs has reduced, evidencing that the non-staff costs this year are a lot more significant. So looking at teacher retention as well, and this continues to become a major issue within the sector, and based on our discussions, that there seems to be a lack of publicising some of the retention incentives, whereby additional payments can be given to teachers in their first 5 years as a kind of encouragement to stay within the profession. I think for the 23-24 year, there was a payment up to £3,000, and this is due to increase in future years as well. What we are seeing in the CFO salaries, that there is quite a lot of movement when comparing to prior years. We've seen some increases in the primary SATs and the medium maths, but small decreases in other areas. We are quite unclear at this stage if it's due to kind of budget pressures or just the general market conditions. But what we do know is that the trusts are still finding it quite difficult to fill some of the vacancies for this job role. Next slide, please, Georgia. And then the two kind of other main costs in the year, the big one being the energy costs, with energy costs increasing by a minimum of 49% compared with the prior year, and almost doubled over the last 2 years. This was probably not unexpected, given the fact that a lot of trusts had tied into longer term energy contracts, which came to an end in the current year, and them having to sign up to new contracts on a lot higher rates. There was extra income received in the year to help with some of these increases, but the costs have far outweighed the funding being received. And then the other key area being supply costs, which is another area for concern. We have noted increases either due to staff sickness or just difficulty recruiting in the sector. And based on some of the published data, it noted that 67.5% of teachers took sick leave in 2022 compared to 45.3% in 21. And given some of the data that we've also seen, that if trusts don't have the money to pay for the supply costs, they're just making do with the current staffing arrangements that they have within the schools, even if this means that the staff being put in the supply roles aren't necessarily suited to the required cover. And therefore, trusts need to start considering in a bit more detail how they're going to cover these absences or vacant posts going forward, both from a financial and educational perspective. Next slide, Georgia. I think my last slide covers the balance sheets. So I think historically trusts have tended to focus quite heavily on income and expenditure results rather than the balance sheets. And we can now see a lot more focus on a number of balance sheet items, typically the fixed assets, the cash, and the reserves of trusts. Overall, the trust's balance sheet has remained relatively strong in the current year, although the average free reserves movement per pupil has seen a dip. The overall balances are actually still quite large. Although, as mentioned earlier, the future financial forecasting suggests that these reserves will continue to deplete over the coming years if the financial situation stays the same for trusts. Cash is also another balance that has remained quite strong over the current year, and our data shows that a lot of trusts are holding significant balances, some of which over 10 million. With that said, the banks are now kind of offering a lot higher interest rates of 4 or 5%, which now does allow the trust to make quite modest amount of interest income, which, although not kind of the grant income levels, will help some of the cost increases being seen in the year. But with that said as well, that trust should also be mindful of the government guarantees of bank balances that's set at just 85,000, and noting that trusts are holding significant cash balances, they do need to consider that. And then looking at fixed assets, we've seen an increase in capital investment in the year, potentially trusts playing catch up post-COVID, where they weren't able to undertake a number of capital projects. But there is a huge emphasis on schools now to focus on the estate management, and that was very clear in the current year with the extra disclosures that were required in the financial statements, namely the Trustees report. However, what is unclear at the moment is how schools are going to fund the future capital projects, given the uncertainty of being able to obtain capital funding, and the forecasted reduction in the free reserves may mean that the trust can't actually fund these out of their own reserves. And then the last point to note on the balance sheet, really, and one of the key movements again was in relation to the pension deficits. In FY23, we did continue to see a decrease in the liability due to the changes in the actuarial assumptions, and even in some instances saw the pension move into an asset position, which caused quite a lot of discussion in the sector and how to account for these balances. on the balance sheet. And as a Kreston network collectively, it was decided that if we did see that the pension move into an asset position, that we didn't reflect this in the financial statements. So I think that's all for me. So I think I'll pass back over to Darren to cover the other sections of the benchmarking report.
Thank you, Becky. Okay, so moving to multi-academy trusts. I think I highlighted earlier that there has been an increase in terms of the amount of schools in MATs, but actually the number of MATs itself have stayed relatively stable. So I think it is more schools entering existing trusts rather than new trusts being set up. And you can see that below as the average number of schools in a MAT now is 10.5, a small increase from the year before. What is a rather larger increase is GAG pooling, and in the first few years, or the first 5 years of the academy sector, GAG pooling was probably quite low in terms of its uptake. We're now seeing a much larger portion, 32% now, and perhaps that's due to the amount of central services that need to be provided, and there's a little bit more about that on the next slide. So over to the next slide, please. So I suppose picking up the right-hand side first, increased centralisation, which I think is a continuing of that common theme, that we are seeing more GAG pooling and more central services provided. I think gone of the days are fully decentralised, I think, as I alluded to at the beginning, to really get the efficiencies and the benefits of the collaborative working, you do need a centralised system. So I suppose if you've decided not to GAG pool, or it's something you haven't done so far, then probably the alternative is to fund central services through top slicing. And we are also seeing that increase. Again, common theme, that more resources are needed to cover the central costs. I think there's a little bit more to be done in that area, though, because we are seeing quite a lot of central cost funds, for want of a better word, going into deficit. So I think there's either a need for more GAG pooling or more top slicing to fund that over a period of time. Next slide, please. So moving to governance. Clearly governance is very important, particularly in turbulent and challenging times. We are seeing the role of the governance professional increase. Many schools have moved away from the clerking type role and referring to it as a governance professional. Probably still a little bit undervalued in the sector. There's lots of training to try and upskill the individuals that carry out that work, and to make sure that they are really given the prominence that they deserve. They play a very important role in the governance of trusts. Yeah, trustees, if you take back to the most fundamental level, are very important to challenge management. So if the trustee composition is not quite right, it's likely that you're not challenging management in the way that you should. So I think the next couple of slides just focus on that, really, and some of the challenges there are around recruiting and retaining trustees. And I think that's quite prevalent and quite easy to see within the demographic graph on this slide, that perhaps unsurprising, the younger generations are not currently taking on too many trustee roles, perhaps because of the point they are in their life and don't necessarily have the time available. I think we're all aware that before you turn up to a governing body meeting, there tends to be a significant amount of papers to read, and there's also the amount of documentation coming out of the ESFA now, and do people have the time? It's something I suppose the profession and the sector will need to keep an eye on. And is it bringing in enough younger talent? And I suppose that's something we'll see over a period of time. Next slide, please. I suppose a similar theme is around committee sizes, and we are seeing now, as the graph shows, that some trusts are running quite lean committees in terms of the number of committees. I think when we first were involved in the sector, there were a number of subcommittees and so on, and we are seeing that being limited now. And that perhaps is due to the lack of trustees available in the market, the lack of volunteers available, I suppose, and the pressures and risk that comes with it. So we are seeing that trusts are having to cut their committee numbers down in some cases. But once you have your board, I suppose, yeah, and I mentioned board composition, it is very important to look at the skills to make sure you are covering off HR, legal, accounts, education, and so on. And that becomes harder as you have fewer trustees to pick from, or a smaller trustee pool perhaps. So it is something that we all need to keep an eye on, and some of this is borne out in governance reviews. It's encouraged to carry out governance reviews. A lot of trusts are still internally carrying out those reviews. It's interesting that an external review could bring fresh ideas, perspectives, and independent views. So it's something that we would encourage over time. And there's also the diversity challenge, making sure that your governing body is a broad representation of your school, whether that be by all sorts of different diversity metrics. And that is something that perhaps is a challenge as it currently stands. Over to the next slide, please. So moving to a poll question. What is the biggest financial challenge facing trusts? Now, I think on this poll, you can mark down more than one. Perhaps if everyone wants to do 3, that would be useful, and we can see what financial challenges trusts are currently facing. This was an actual question that was asked as part of the benchmarking report, so it'll be interesting to see whether the viewers today are in line with the wider benchmarking report. Clearly, all listed are challenges. Energy costs, perhaps it would depend on when you answered the question. The benchmarking report, the questions are asked before Christmas, and perhaps energy prices are slightly different now from where they were. But interesting to see at this snapshot in time what are the main challenges. So I'll wait another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll close the poll and see how it's come out. We could close that off now, Georgia, please. So very interesting. So staff costs is very high up. Falling pupil roll, that's interesting to see, and energy costs, of course, pension costs. So quite a broad range, I think, probably because they're all big challenges, and so that's very, very interesting to see. So let's see how that compares to what was in the report. So let's move to the next slide, please, Georgia. So yeah, teaching costs, whether it's general staff, non-teaching or teaching, falling pupil roll, energy costs. So I think our viewers today broadly are in line with the report that we prepared, which is interesting to see that in a few months on, the same challenges are being faced. So yeah, very interesting results. Thank you for your participation. So let's continue to move through and let's see where we are. Next slide, please. So we have come to the end of today's webinar. That was a whistle-stop tour through, conscious of time, so we'll close off fairly quickly. But if you do have any questions, I can't see any that have been asked, but if you do have any questions, then please do pick up the phone or email one of us or your regular contacts at James Cooper Kreston, and we'll be more than happy to help in any way we can. Equally, there's some links there to our website and also to the benchmarking report, where you could perhaps do a bit more of a deep dive and look at it with a more specific and analytical review in terms of your own trust. So I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending today. I hope it was useful, and I hope you'll join us again for a future webinar. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.